All right. Next one we're looking at today is also by my dad, Robin Riggs. This sermon was written for December 16th, 2018, Sunday morning at Fairmount Church of God in Fairmount, Indiana. This sermon is titled The Path of Peace, Luke 1:79, chapter 1, verse 79. All right. There's a path of peace. There's a path that destroys peace also. Many people want peace, but most people are on the path that destroys it. What leads to peace, you might ask? What is the way that takes us there? How do many miss it when they want it so much? And are there people who really don't want peace, but instead thrive on conflict, violence, hatred, and confusion? According to our text in Luke 1:57 through 79, an angel had appeared to Zechariah to announce to him that his elderly wife Elizabeth would have a son by God's power. Zechariah doubted, and so his power of speech was taken away until his son would be born. Now that birth had occurred, and Zechariah's tongue was loosed, and he was finally able to speak again, and he began to prophesy. He was prophesying about the role his son John would play, but also about the one who would go after him. So his son was born to show the way to Jesus. At the end of the prophecy, John declares that Jesus would lead us in the way of peace. That if we want to find the way of peace, we have to learn it from Jesus. No one else has the whole picture like he does. So what has Jesus done, and what has he taught us that shows us the way of peace? When you go to a park or a beach, or spend an evening with family, it's hard to think in those peaceful times that at the same moment, terrible things are happening in other places in the world. And sometimes those terrible things are so far away, but eventually sometimes they come closer to home. At this time, back in 2018, let me see what that date was again. December 16th, 2018, the Friday before this sermon was written, was the 6-year anniversary of the shootings at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newton, Connecticut. Where 20 innocent children and 6 teachers lost their lives. On the day of that anniversary, which was the Friday before this sermon, the school received a bomb threat, and the school was closed and the children were sent home. The day before that shooting took place 6 years ago, in 2012, a crazed student entered Arapahoe County High School near Denver, Colorado, and he shot a peer in the head at point-blank range in his search for a teacher who had dared to discipline him. It just so happens that Arapahoe County High School is only 8 miles from Columbine High School and 17 miles from the infamous movie theater in Aurora, Colorado. These are just some of the lone gunman shootings and rampages in the United States, but there have been many others, before then and since. And I've said nothing of the senseless executions in North Korea, or the nuclear tension in Iran, or the protests in France and civil war in Syria, or the genocides happening in some of the African countries, or even some of the things happening now in the United States. When we consider all the strife and unrest around our world, it makes it seem as if peace is nothing more than a pipe dream, and for good reason. I think violence is out of control. How can we ever consider that peace might prevail when there is so much fighting? Yet God has spoken of a world of justice, a world of peace, which is why we today are talking about the promise of Christmas as peace. The path to God's peace is the child lying in the manger, the baby who would grow up to proclaim God's special blessing upon the merciful and the peacemakers, the one who would reveal the way of peace. I suppose it seems somewhat odd that peace doesn't come through the violent suppression of violence, seeing as that's how we usually seek peace in our world today, but we want to know God's approach to peace. When John the Baptist was born just a few months before Jesus, his father Zechariah, able to speak for the first time in 9 months, broke into prophecy about his son. Zechariah said that John would be a prophet of the Most High God, preparing the way for him and telling people how God would save the people from their sins. Zechariah shares the vision of God, bringing light to those sitting in the shadows of darkness and death, guiding people to the path of peace. People expected the Most High God, the Messiah, to be a conquering hero, someone who would sweep into the world and quickly vanquish Israel's enemies. The Jews fully expected that their enemies would suffer some violent fate that they had been the same violent fate that Israel had been suffering for generations. And when Zechariah begins to prophesy, the first prophecy among the Israelites in over 400 years was when Zechariah opened his mouth to prophesy after John's birth. And he tells a different story. He says his son John has come to show us the path to peace, and Jesus is coming to show us the path to peace. A few months later, another baby was born, weak and vulnerable, peaceful even. And though he was not a conquering hero, he was the Messiah. Violence perpetuates violence, and seeking peace through violence only adds to that cycle. But when you make yourself vulnerable in the face of violence, what brings peace? That brings peace in a completely different way. Can violence be conquered with nonviolence? Jesus said, "Do not resist the evil one. If someone strikes you on the cheek, offer him the other." Is that realistic? Is it effective? In Romans 12, Paul wrote, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." I love that verse. I think it's very powerful, but there are some situations where I wonder how it works. How is evil overcome? Is God always stronger than evil? Is good always stronger than evil? I have to believe it is. When violence is countered with nonviolence, with true peace, it exposes the sheer brutality of violence, whether it is in the form of fighting and killing, or of harmful speech and emotional abuse. In modern video games, violence is made attractive. Even if your character is a good guy, he usually has to be very violent, even as a good guy. It takes a violent good guy, to overcome a violent bad guy. This is carried over in other cultural norms: television, movies, politics, church. Humility, sacrifice, and peace make violence unattractive. God intended from the very beginning that this world, his creation, would be a peaceful place, a place where, as Isaiah says, the wolf will live with the lamb and the leopard lie down with the young goat. And as Isaiah foretold a little later in that same passage, God sent his very own son, a baby, a child, to show us how to make that peaceful kingdom a reality, which is exactly what Jesus did. I'm not talking about Jesus looking cute, all swaddled in a manger with animals squeezed in around him in an endearing admiration. Sure, that would have been a lovely, peaceful scene. It is always the case with resting newborns. But Jesus went on to live a life of peace and even to teach us the way of peace. Jesus engaged opponents in debate, fought against evil, hate, and error. He wasn't silent about these things, because to be a peacemaker is to confront those things that take away peace, to battle the progress of sin in the world. But his motive was his love for the world that would lead him to the cross. In the upper room, as Jesus prepared his disciples for his departure, he said to them, "Peace I leave you, my peace I give you. I give to you not as the world gives. Don't be troubled or afraid." And later that night, when Peter pulled out his sword and cut off the ear of a soldier in an effort to keep Jesus, an innocent man, from being arrested, Jesus didn't thank Peter for coming to his defense. He rebuked Peter. He told Peter to put the sword away. And then when the people began to mock Jesus and the soldiers beat him and hung him on a cross, he did not fight back. He suffered in agony so that we could be freed of our sins. He suffered so that we could live in peace. And then when the people began, I already said that part. In 1 Peter 2:21-23, "For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth, and while being reviled, he did not revile in return. And while suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously." Yet here's the thing. As with so much of the Christian life, peace is not something that exists simply because Christ was born. Peace is a way of life. Jesus lived it. Jesus teaches us about peace. Zechariah prophesied that Jesus would guide us on the path to peace. If we expect peace to be a reality, we have to follow the path that Jesus has laid out for us. Jesus inaugurated God's kingdom on earth, and even as we look for that day when Christ will return and establish the reign of peace once and for all, we can begin living into God's kingdom even now. We can know the peace of God's kingdom even now, but we have to make it happen. That means we have to let go of the anger, the judgment, the hatred, the resentment, the fears, all those things that keep us from experiencing peace. The church is where that peace should be found, where it should be seen. The company of the redeemed. The world does not receive Christ's peace until they accept Christ. Several years ago, just 5 days before Christmas, there was a 10-year-old Chris Carrier who was approached by a man claiming to be a friend of his father. He told Chris he wanted to buy his dad a gift and needed help picking something out. Eager to do something good for his dad, Chris climbed aboard the motorhome parked on the street, and the driver took Chris to a remote field. Claiming to be lost, then as Chris studied a map, he was stabbed in the back with an ice pick. The man drove the wounded boy down a dirt road, shot him in the left temple, and left him for dead. Blinded in one eye, Chris miraculously survived the injuries and was discovered 6 days later. Chris was not able to identify his attacker, and so no arrest was ever made. He lived his life in constant fear, deeply troubled and highly suspicious. But then 3 years after the attack, Chris dedicated his life to Christ, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt comfort and peace rather than suspicion and fear. Eventually, Chris made the decision to pursue full-time ministry so that he could help others. He wanted others to find the peace that he had discovered through Christ. Over 20 years later, this was back in 1996, a detective called Chris to tell him that a man had confessed to the crime that had cost him his left eye. Dave McAllister had been hired by Chris's father to work as a nurse for his ailing uncle. Chris's dad had caught McAllister drinking on the job and had fired him. The senseless attack on Chris had been motivated by revenge. Now at 77 years old, 77, David McAllister was in feeble condition, living in a nursing home, and Chris made plans to visit him. When McAllister learned who Chris was on his first visit, he apologized. And Chris said, "I told him what you meant for evil, God turned into a wonderful blessing." And Chris went on to tell his attacker how God had allowed his wounds to become open doors to share the good news of Christ with others. That visit became the first of many, and Chris would often bring his family with him to the nursing home. During one Sunday afternoon visit, Chris asked the most important question he had. "Do you want to know the Lord?" McAllister said yes, and both men basked in forgiveness as McAllister gave his heart to Christ. A few days later, McAllister died, peacefully, in his sleep. Chris says it's not a story of regret, but of redemption. "I saw the Lord give that man back his life, and so much more. He was able to experience peace just like I was, and I can't wait to see him again someday in heaven." It's become almost cliche at Christmas time to wish for world peace. We hear it a lot, don't we? My only wish for Christmas is world peace. We sing songs about it and all kinds of stuff, but how many of us are actually doing something to make peace a reality in our lives? Sure, we may not be the ones walking the streets at night looking for a fight or running into crowded school buildings with an arsenal of loaded weapons, but that doesn't mean we aren't holding a grudge against someone right this minute. That doesn't mean that we don't get angry and honk our horns and make obscene gestures when we get caught off in traffic. We all contribute to the lack of peace in our world in one way or another. And if we all truly follow the example of Christ, we can also lead the way to true peace.